Mr. Speaker, when one listens to the propaganda that the UWP government surrogates spew on social media and on their favorite radio station, it can be said that these people are well-paid propagandists, family members, or begging failed geriatric politicians. But when the Prime Minister seems to follow that lead, and at a time when the country is in crisis, he tables in his honorable house an unrealistic set of estimates that seem to bear no relationship with the real situation in St. Lucia. We on this side, and the majority of St. Lucians have concluded that our country is in crisis and the Prime Minister is out of touch with the real situation as it exists for the people of St. Lucia. In March 2020, when the government finally accepted the reality of the COVID pandemic, I warned that our country was ill-prepared and there were rough times ahead. And the government should take immediate action to mitigate the effects of COVID, since we as a country were ill-prepared to handle the crisis. 1 year later, St. Lucia has surpassed 4,000 cases and 55 deaths. Mr. Speaker, 55 St. Lucians have died, and we cannot justify that horror by simply stating pre-existing conditions, meaning that that death was normal. Mr. Speaker, the country is in mourning, and the government does not seem to care. These deaths could have been avoided if the state of healthcare in our country was better. A government that destroyed 2 buildings at St. Jude's for no reason, just to make a political point, to settle a political vendetta. A government that believes that public relations and propaganda will mask the reality of the 2 St. Lucias that we live in. Our health and well-being continue to be victims of electioneering and optical illusions of renderings and false sword-turnings. Mr. Speaker, the government cannot hide its failure in dealing with COVID. The number of deaths is testimony to that failure. The estimates as presented give no indication that the government will confront the reality of COVID, since they have borrowed nearly 400 million for COVID response, and our people continue to suffer at our hospitals. We need to praise and compliment our healthcare professionals and the first responders for the human service that they deliver to our people every day. Mr. Speaker, the reality of the government's failure with COVID cannot be hidden with personal attacks, lies, and propaganda. Let us compare St. Lucia with our neighbors. St. Lucia has a population of 175,000, has recorded more deaths than its neighbors, more deaths than the entire OECS region combined. St. Lucia has suffered more deaths. Martinique has a population of 285,000. Martinique has recorded 47 deaths. Barbados has a population of 285,000. Martinique has recorded 38 deaths. Trinidad and Tobago has a population of 1.3 million. Trinidad and Tobago has recorded 147 deaths. St. Lucia has recorded more COVID deaths than all the other countries in the OECS. But the government continues to blame everyone but itself. The government continues to blame everyone but itself. The government and its enablers and tax-funded propagandists continue to peddle fake news and misinformation. Mr. Speaker, we continue to be concerned about the state of healthcare in St. Lucia. We ask the government, and the estimates do not seem to solve the problem. We ask the government, What is the status of the promised improvements to the oxygen supply at the respiratory hospital? What are the measures to be applied to determine the phasing of the reopening of schools? What are the targets which must be attained for the reopening of schools?
Honorable Leader, I know in your introduction, but just want to remind you and members, again, I was standing order 6410. I know you're in your introductory state, so I'm not going to interfere, but just to let you and other members know.
Mr. Speaker, speaking about the allocation for health in the estimates.
I'm not trying to get to you, stop you. I'm just alerting every member that, yeah.
Why are we not engaging in more aggressive community testing in tandem with vaccination? Our testing still remains low when compared to the other islands. What is the acceptable ratio for tests as compared to positive results? The R factor. Has the government made adequate arrangements to vaccinate 70% of the population so as to achieve herd immunity? Mr. Speaker, the sorry tale of the COVID deaths and the over 4,000 cases is directly related to the government not caring for the healthcare system on our island. Mr. Speaker, I invite you to refer to page 452 of the estimates tabled in this Honorable House. Mr. Speaker, let's examine item 1209, consulting services and commissions. And you will see 2018-2019, 2.4 million. That's on page 462 of last year's estimates. 2019 to 2020, 5.1 million. 2020-2021, 12.8 million. An increase of $4 million. Total in the 3 years for consulting services and commissions in the health ministry of $20.3 million. And this year, it's projected that this government will spend $18.1 million on consultancies in the Ministry of Health. Mr. Speaker, who are these consultancies being paid to? In the Ministry of Health? Are these fees being paid to friends and foreign consultants, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, the $20.3 million over the last 3 years and the proposed $18 million to be spent for consultancies in the Ministry of Health. Consultancies in the Ministry of Health, Mr. Speaker. Well, this government continues to show contempt for local professionals who successfully commissioned the OKE hospital in 2021, not at the cost of $18 million for consultancies. The $38.4 million that the government has spent $20 million and intends to spend another $18 million, Mr. Speaker, could be used to fund the health center in Denry North, to improve the oxygen supply at Victoria Hospital, could have a national COVID education and vaccination campaign aimed at vaccinating the entire population. It could refurbish and upgrade health centers and wellness centers and provide it with 24 hours of staffing. It could improve conditions, including equipment and medication at the OKU hospital. It could increase dialysis machines and the staffing. It could improve working conditions of nurses, doctors, and other health providers. But this government prefers to spend $18 million on consultancy for foreign consultants in the health service. $18 million, a total of $20 million in the last 3 years, and $38.4 million on consultancies in the Ministry of Health for foreigners before the year is over, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the St. Lucia Labour Party believes in the competency, the skill, and the ability of the professionals in the St. Lucia health sector. And we will always put them first. We believe that a recently appointed management team is willing and able to successfully manage the OKU hospital and call on the government to cancel or rescind any contract with foreign consultants whose motive is to maximize profits while our people suffer. Mr. Speaker, the government has its priorities all wrong. It is an uncaring government living in an alternative reality. Mr. Speaker, another example of the uncaring nature of this government is in its handling of the St. Jude Hospital construction project. Mr. Speaker, the estimates of expenditure, page 525, code 0078, show the expenditure under the St. Jude Hospital reconstruction project. 2018 to 2019, 4.5 million, page 537 of the estimates. 2019 to 2020, 29.7 million. 2020 to 2021, 44.7 million. A total of $79.3 million between 2018 and 2021. And projected for the coming year, $12 million, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, I ask you to look at page 525 on the estimates and look at the head St. Jude Hospital Reconstruction Project, code 0078, page 525, Mr. Speaker. And you will see that apart from the St. Jude's Hospital Reconstruction Project, the expenses here, the 44, you will see that there are recurrent expenditure, Mr. Speaker. I would like to get an explanation, Mr. Speaker, as to how the $79 million was used and St. Jude Hospital still is not open. After 7 years of United Workers' Party rule, 7 years, Mr. Speaker, after 7 years, they like to speak about years, Mr. Speaker. The United Workers' Party have been in control of the hospital construction for more than 7 years. They have destroyed 2 buildings, and up to today, St. Jude Hospital has not opened, Mr. Speaker, and the people of the South continue to suffer from inadequate health care. Mr. Speaker, the government demolished 2 buildings. We have to include the cost of these 2 buildings in the $79 million that has been spent, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government has presided over the St. Jude reconstruction. They came into government in 2016, proclaiming to be builders, to be workers, to be able to get things done, to be able to complete things, Mr. Speaker. Up to this day, St. Jude Hospital has not been completed, Mr. Speaker. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? They believe that the false renderings, the photo ops, and the cladding, Mr. Speaker, it'll be a good question. Who procured the cladding? Was the cladding procured by tendering? Who is the supplier of the cladding? But, Mr. Speaker, instead, we have pictures, we have tours of an unfinished Victoria Hospital because the time of reckoning is near. The time when the people of St. Lucia will ask, why haven't you completed St. Jude Hospital? After you've spent more than $80 million, you've accused the former government of all sorts of things, you still have not completed the St. Jude Hospital, Mr. Speaker. You have not completed. Mr. Speaker, the government has presided over the St. Jude reconstruction for 7 years now. 7 years, Mr. Speaker, and the buildings have not been completed. Mr. Speaker, to further illustrate the government's scorn and disregard for the people of St. Lucia, the Prime Minister visits the uncompleted structure for photo opportunities and declares that the cladding shows that things are happening. We are workers. We have put cladding in the hospital. We are workers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, talking about workers, I want to invite you to page 525 of the estimates, Mr. Speaker. The St. Jude Hospital is managed by the Ministry of Economic Development and is headed by the Minister of Everything, who boasts of his ability to get things done. He's a worker. He can perform. He knows about construction. He's an engineer. He knows about everything else, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, look at page 525 and have a look at the program performance information. And you will see, Mr. Speaker, that none of the key program strategies have been achieved by that minister in the Ministry of Economic Development as far as that project is concerned. I invite you to take a look. It hasn't got to be a document of the House, to look at page 525, Mr. Speaker, and see for yourself the performance as it relates to the program performance as it relates to the strategies outlined for that minister. Mr. Speaker, while I speak about consultancies, Mr. Speaker, there's an allocation of $65 million is made for consultancies in these estimates, Mr. Speaker. And I remember, Mr. Speaker, there was talk of a public sector modernization plan, where a total of 154 services were to be modernized from 2019. To date, it is my understanding that only 17 of these services have been completed. What was the exact cost of that consultancy, Mr. Speaker, and who was that consultant? Mr. Speaker, whilst we are on the business of modernization, Mr. Speaker, it would be interesting for us to know what is the status of the WIPE investigation. Mr. Speaker, expenditure of $65 million in consultancy fees in this fiscal year is the 5th highest expense item for the year 2021-2022. Out of that figure, as I said, 18 million is at the Ministry of Health, while the actual health situation in the country is worsening. Where is the health insurance promised by this government from 2017? The blame cannot be placed on COVID, Mr. Speaker. Where is the health insurance, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, the money paid to these foreign consultants, $18 million, is $7 million more than what is allocated to public assistance of $11 million. The government pays foreign consultants $7 million more than they will have for public assistance for the needy people of St. Lucia. Does this government care? Does this government really care, Mr. Speaker? You pay consultants more money than you give the poor and the needy? Mr. Speaker, the children cannot get laptops. Their parents are hungry. The children have no laptops. And elections are coming, so you speak about e-books. That's for another show, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let us do a brief economic analysis of the budget or the estimates as been presented by the Prime Minister. You will note, Mr. Speaker, that there was no social and economic review with these estimates. And there are at least 2 ministers of finance in this honorable House. We'd like to ask them, has there ever been a time when estimates were tabled in this honorable House without a social and economic review? There was no social and economic review tabled in these estimates, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, there was no social and economic review tabled with the estimates of expenditure, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance will conveniently blame COVID for his mismanagement of the economy. However, that was the same government that boasted about the economic management before COVID. They boasted that the economy was the best. They were workers. That the economy was the best, Mr. Speaker. And they compared St. Lucia with other islands. We need to find out, Mr. Speaker, what is the comparison between St. Lucia now and the other islands that they boasted about before. COVID was an equal opportunity pandemic. Countries big and small suffered from its impact. However, the effects on St. Lucia were disproportionate, Mr. Speaker. our GDP dropped lower than any other country in the OECS. Our economy performed the worst in the entire OECS. Our GDP contracted by over 18%, Mr. Speaker. We borrowed the most, and our people received little direct income support from the government. Mr. Speaker, the economy of our country was underperforming from 2019, and the figures will show. COVID made the situation worse because there were no surpluses to sustain the economy when COVID hit. The government must take full responsibility for the mismanagement of the economy of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said, and we agree, that 2021 was a challenging year. It was a challenging year, Mr. Speaker. Yet, instead of being cautious, he continues to boast. He continues to boast, Mr. Speaker. The same boast that they spoke of when COVID started, they are continuing the boast, Mr. Speaker. But the estimates, Mr. Speaker, present a very bleak picture. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "So much uncertainty about economic recovery, which is compounded by the fact that we are confronting several unknowns with limited fiscal resources given the erosion of our public finances over the last year." Mr. Speaker, although the government spent less than was budgeted in the last approved estimates by over $1 million, they still exceeded the target of an 8.1% fiscal deficit to an 11.3% deficit of GDP. And the fiscal deficit projected at the end of 21-22 is 7.9%. Another disastrous position, Mr. Speaker. There was significant shortfall of projected revenue coupled with excessive capital expenses and an unprecedented fiscal deficit.
Honorable Member, just point me to the page, please, so that I could follow you.
That is the first page, Mr. Speaker. The budget summary. You found it? And what does the government take comfort in, Mr. Speaker? It takes comfort in that they say the loans are concessional and the loans are for a longer period, Mr. Speaker. The government takes comfort, Mr. Speaker. So they are borrowed, they have the debt to GDP ratio of our country will be in excess of 100% by the end of this financial year. But the government takes comfort, Mr. Speaker, in the fact that
Mr. Speaker. The member,
Mr. Speaker, could the Prime Minister say the point of order he's speaking on? What number? He just says point of order. What number?
Honorable Member.
He's misleading the House. I don't know where he's getting this 100% debt to GDP. There is, as to his own point, the social and economic review is not out. In fact, on the budget side, it doesn't make any reference to what the debt to GDP is. So there is a report that came out by the IMF and the CDB which talks about 86%. So please not to mislead the House, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I said that by the end of this financial year, the debt to GDP ratio of this country will be near 100%.
Mr. Speaker, there is no evidence to that. All the
that is my understanding of the facts.
Honorable members, honorable members.
His understanding is misleading the House because it's not based on facts.
Mr. Speaker, it is still my understanding. By the end of this financial year, the debt to GDP is more than 100%.
Honorable. You're not quoting any. Are you quoting any source?
Mr. Speaker, I am speaking from my analysis of the figures presented to me, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Prime Minister, I think he's coming to his own conclusion based on.
So it's a matter of his opinion. Okay, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the government has borrowed over $400 million this year. It has borrowed over $400 million this year, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government boasts
again, the member
about
is using information to mislead the House. How much you borrow doesn't mean that it's attributing and going towards the debt of the country.
What?
The document says that, in fact, what we've done is we've added $320 million to the debt stock of the country.
Okay, the government has borrowed between $320 and $400 million.
No, Mr. Speaker.
Mr.
Again,
Speaker.
The member.
Honorable members.
He's going to get the information correct. Say it correctly.
Honorable members, let's not start the morning
Mr.
on
Speaker,
the wrong footing.
the truth hurts. Mr. Speaker, the government boasts about the construction of the Ivanhoe Airport. The business model on which the Ivanhoe Airport construction was based on was on the receipt of airport tax revenue. The government has not adjusted the business model, but they assume that they were the best prepared for COVID. They assume that they will be able to meet the requirements of the airport construction, even at a time when there is still great concern about travel. The government assumes, without even amending or adjusting the model where the sole source of revenue to pay back the loan is the airport tax, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how can the government explain a $1.6 billion budget in 2021 versus a $1.5 billion in 2019-2020? When times are harder, your budget is more. Is that realistic, Mr. Speaker? A higher budget in worse times. Mr. Speaker, let us examine the estimates in a little more detail. The total revenue and grants, Mr. Speaker, the 2021 estimates were $1.019 billion, was lower by 13%. It is $883 million, Mr. Speaker. When compared to the expected outcome, it was lower than 14%. But the government is projecting another $1 billion, an increase of 14%, and a difference of $118 million this year. Mr. Speaker, and the projected total revenue from 2019, when times were not as bad, the economy underperformed by $51 million when compared to the actual, when compared to what was projected, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the economy was underperforming from the year 2019. It has been, and the figures are clear, Mr. Speaker. Is it realistic that there's going to be a 26% increase in revenue? Because you had a 13% decrease over your projected figures, and this year you're projecting a 13% increase. So that means you are saying that your economy will, your revenue will increase by 26%, Mr. Speaker. Is that realistic? Mr. Speaker, the same thing for total revenue and grants, the same thing. A 19%, a decrease of 19% between the estimates and the projected performance. And this year, a projected 24% increase, or $211 million, meaning that the overall increase is projected to be 47%, Mr. Speaker. However, in there's a provision for an increase in grants by 290%, from $41 million to what you performed this year to $121 million this year, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish and I hope that this is true, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the economy of St. Lucia has been underperforming from 2019, and the figures show for themselves, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, what is more interesting is if you turn to page 4, Mr. Speaker, 1V, you will see that there is a deficit of revenue, a budget gap projected of $802 million. And that is the summary of government operations and financing. The government used to finance has a gap of $802 million, Mr. Speaker, which they intend to finance. But that is the budget gap. That is a deficit. That is a deficit. It is called a balanced surplus deficit of revenue over expenditure. There's a revenue, the revenue of expenditure, there is a gap of $802 million, projected to be $630 million at the end of this year, Mr. Speaker. And all the other deficits continue to increase. A trend before COVID and after COVID has become even more alarming, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, you will also note that there continues to be a provision for VAT. A VAT that the government promised to eliminate in the election campaign in 2016. They continue to make a provision for VAT, Mr. Speaker. The same government that castigated the Labour Party for imposing VAT, and they promised in the fight to stay alive to remove VAT, Mr. Speaker, to eliminate VAT. These were the exact words. But VAT remains, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government's poor fiscal record will make it very difficult for the new Labour Party government to raise money. Because, Mr. Speaker, they will have to seek finance from local banks, which is likely to crowd out private investors. Because all the concessionary, because I was reading, Mr. Speaker, that the IMF is saying that these loans will have to be repaid, Mr. Speaker. And when you talk about free money, these loans have to be paid, and the children, the young people of St. Lucia will have to pay these loans, Mr. Speaker. So very soon, without strict fiscal management and fiscal discipline, Mr. Speaker, and the government will find it difficult to be able to borrow money regionally or internationally, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 cannot be covered for the government because they have performed poorly in health, and in the economy, the signs were there from before COVID-19. The government placed their priority on the well-being of horses. They put horses before hospitals. The people of the South are still without adequate health care, and the horse racing track is still there, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government, when it is voted out of power this year, will leave an economy behind where there is little or no fiscal space to do anything significant. The debt to GDP ratio is increasing, Mr. Speaker. Suppliers of government goods and services are already finding it difficult and will find it increasingly difficult to receive their checks from the Treasury unless if you are connected and a call doesn't come through. The government cannot blame anyone but itself for its wrong priorities. They do not put people first. They had hoped that the lack of performance will be masked by attacks, public relations, playing the blame game, peddling untruths and propaganda on the opposition, Mr. Speaker. Whilst they encourage acts of vindictiveness and political retribution, they have used the NIC funds because there were no existing surpluses from the government operations, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, this government has pledged that we will pay back to the NIC the funds that were taken from them by the government, Mr. Speaker. Because the government is failing to tell the people of St. Lucia that the actual report of the NIC says that by 2050, if there are not fundamental changes to the NIC will run short of funds by the year 2050. Yes. Mr. Speaker, the government, again, the blame game, instead of admitting that what the report says is true, the Prime Minister will arrogantly say, really, and when he knows very well, and you can make it a document of the House, that the accurate report in the NIC says that by 2050, if there are not any changes, the NIC will run short of money. Mr. Speaker, by 2050, if there are no changes, the NIC will run short of money, and this government continues to take the money and give it to foreigners, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, even when funds are earmarked for the people of St. Lucia, this government discriminates. On page 524, Mr. Speaker, the Constituency Development Fund, expenses of $18 million for this financial year. Mr. Speaker, there was no opposition politician was consulted on any project this year, Mr. Speaker. And $18 million of CDP funds from the people of Taiwan was said to be expensed in St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government priorities are wrong. And you expect to hear them boast. You expect to hear them boast. You expect to hear them attack people personally. But, Mr. Speaker, the government, Mr. Speaker, cannot explain to the people of St. Lucia why they are spending $20 million on less than 2 miles of road. As we speak, the government is spending, without tender, $20 million on less than 2 miles of road. That is the priority of this government, Mr. Speaker. That is the priority. $20 million on less than 2 miles of road at Rodney Bay, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hope they can explain.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, the member continues to mislead the House, and I don't know whether these are the rules, Mr. Speaker, that you can just, because you're an opposition MP, you can call any number. But if the member is going to say that the government is going to spend over $20 million, when the evidence is there to show that the contract for these roads is not $20 million, then where is the member getting his information from? Is he allowed to just say what he wants without any evidence to back up the information that he's given?
Mr. Speaker, if the construction of that 2 miles of road...
Leader of the opposition. Honorable Leader of the Opposition, the member interjected at the time, but remember, we are debating the estimates at this time and not general government policy. So it means that you would have to tie whatever you say into the estimate.
Mr. Speaker, in the Ministry of Infrastructure, there's an allocation of $40 million for roads. And since there was no tender, since there was no public tender for the 2 miles of road that are being constructed in the Rodney Bay area, the 2 miles of road that will cost, if the minister is contending that's not 20, it costs between 15 million and 20 million. Mr. Speaker, I hope they can explain to the people who have been unemployed since COVID, the people who find difficulty in feeding their children, the people who cannot pay their utility bills and their rent and their mortgages, the children without laptops, Miss Linda in Bocage, who had to close a shop because of COVID, and now she gets no income, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Marriott in the Marshall Boulevard, who has to close his shop, his only source of income because of COVID, but the government, instead of giving income relief to them, is spending between $15 and $20 million on 2 miles of road in Rodney Bay, Mr. Speaker. That is the point. That's the point, Mr. Speaker. The people of St. Lucia who are suffering because of COVID, and the government says they have done their best, but they can find between $15 and $20 million to spend on 2 miles of road in Rodney Bay, Mr. Speaker. Less than 2 miles of road. Mr. Speaker, doesn't this government have a conscience? Doesn't this government care for the suffering of the children of St. Lucia who have not attended school because they have no laptops or they have no internet access? And they boast, and no election time, they come with e-books because they said, apparently Pierre's key guy in laptops, Mr. Speaker. And the story of the e-books, Mr. Speaker, is yet to be told. Doesn't this government care? Doesn't the government only care about propaganda, attacking people, and renderings, and PR? Does the government care, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, does the government care about the people? Miss Anne, who needs to get a mammogram because the doctor says she has breast cancer and she can't afford it, Mr. Speaker. She needs a mammogram. She has to raise funds and she can't afford it. But the government can find money. The government can find money to spend. The government can find money. Mr. Speaker, he laughs. He laughs because he can afford to go to India for his health care. So he laughs. He laughs, Mr. Speaker. That's a joke, Mr. Speaker. The lady, Mr. Speaker. And I heard the Prime Minister speak about health care for men, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad. I'm happy that the Prime Minister understands the value of diet, and exercise. But the surrogates, when they look at me, who is the poster boy for diet and exercise, they say things about me. Mr. Speaker, does the government care, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, a Labour Party government would use that money that the United Workers' Party spends on 20 miles of road, Mr. Speaker. On 2 miles of road, the $20 million on less than 2 miles of road, Mr. Speaker, the government would use it differently, Mr. Speaker. The government would use it differently. Mr. Speaker, in addition to running the economy...
Honorable. Yes. Good Sergeant. Continue, Honorable.
In addition to running the economy, Mr. Speaker, in deficit and creating hardship for the country, the government is systematically destroying our institutions in the name of forming a new St. Lucia, our indigenous institutions. The United Workers' Party government has defunded the St. Lucia National Trust. They axed Radio St. Lucia. They axed the St. Lucia Tourist Board. They axed the St. Lucia Fish and Marketing Corporation. They undermined... I'm speaking about grants and contributions.
Then you need to tie it into the budget.
Grants and contributions. The grants and contributions and National Trust. The grants. I'm talking about grants and contributions.
Honorable member, just wait for a while. If you need to tie to the estimates, if you don't do that, then it means it is appropriate, my part, for the appropriation bill. Until Speaker, then, you need to tie it to the estimates.
I am speaking on grants and contributions, Mr. Speaker. That's the item I'm speaking on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and they are in the process of eliminating the St. Lucia Development Control Authority. They have recast the St. Lucia Jazz Festival. They are weakening the National Insurance Corporation, and they intended to change Viewfort, the name of Viewfort, to the Pearl of the Caribbean. They are presiding over Windfresh that is collapsing, Mr. Speaker, and you hear nothing about Windfresh, while right now they speak about selling bananas to Miami. The Martinique, the France experiment changed, so there's a new place now, Miami, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the people of St. Lucia deserve meaningful employment during this time, Mr. Speaker. An SLP government will reprioritize some of the expenses that have used up the available fiscal space. We will strive to dismantle the 2 St. Lucias. There are 2 St. Lucias, Mr. Speaker, by reviewing some of the existing expenditure patterns of this government. It's our fundamental belief that there can be no economy without people. We will reintroduce employment programs like NICE by working closely with the private sector. These programs would stimulate growth and protect our people from politicians who give them handouts near election time. We will assist the farmers and fishers directly with income support and help in reducing the cost of production. We will not make false promises of bananas to France, Mr. Speaker. We will fund a vibrant youth economy to harness the talents of our young people and create sustainable employment. We aim at supporting...
Speaker, the debate is about the budget. The member will have plenty of occasion both on the Castries market steps as well as in the appropriations bill to be able to make his philosophies known. This is about the estimates.
What's the point of order?
Honorable Leader of the Opposition, please tie your contribution to the estimate.
Mr. Speaker,
If you don't do it, if you leave it open, it means now that it is more appropriate for the appropriation bill. That's all I'm saying to you, and you said it. It's just coincidentally, I was reading a Hansard copy yesterday of 1988, and the then member for Viewford South, coincidentally, was pretty much the Honorable Peter Josie at the time, was pretty much doing the same thing. And the speaker interjected on pretty much on the same point. There are things that for the estimates and things that for elsewhere. So all I'm saying to you, if you don't tie it to the estimate, it means that it's more appropriate for the appropriation. Continue, sir.
Mr. Speaker, under the head, Mr. Speaker, Ministry of Commerce, Mr. Speaker, we will fund a vibrant youth economy to harness the talents of our young people and create sustainable employment. We aim at supporting aspiring entrepreneurs to develop profitable indigenous businesses, Mr. Speaker. We will provide, Mr. Speaker, under the head, we will provide, Mr. Speaker, tangible support to vendors, small businessmen, self-employed people, early childhood educators. We will provide laptops and internet for the children under the education support system, Mr. Speaker.
Again, Mr. Speaker, this is a manifesto. He has ample opportunity to discuss his manifesto. We are here discussing the estimates, Mr. Speaker, not what his election promises are.
Mr. Speaker, an SLP government would move into meaningful...
Yeah. Honorable members, I know the time and the hour.
The time of reckoning, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member, it means it is not appropriate for the estimates.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hope I have been disturbed for 10 minutes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government of the United Workers' Party does not care about the people of St. Lucia. And the policies, Mr. Speaker, as outlined in the estimates of revenue and expenditure, put friends, family, and foreigners before the people of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, as envisaged by the $18 million for consultancies at the Ministry of Health for foreigners, where only $11 million is being spent to help the dispossessed in this country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, an SLP government, Mr. Speaker, would enter into meaningful consultation with all social partners and not call them names. So we could deliver to the people of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, packages and deliver an economy that would put them first, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how will we find money to fund our budget, Mr. Speaker? How will our estimates of revenue and expenditure be different? We will fund our projects, Mr. Speaker, by vigorously and rigorously fighting corruption, allowing a transparent tendering process, reviewing existing capital works, and most importantly, creating an environment of truth, dialogue, goodwill, openness, honesty, where our financial resources would not benefit a few, but the many. Mr. Speaker, the time of reckoning is nigh. The United Workers' Party government, Mr. Speaker, have been in power in this country for 40 years. They have ruled the destiny of this country for 40 years, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, this last 5 years has been the worst for any government in the history of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as far as the constituency is concerned, Mr. Speaker, this government discriminates against constituencies where members of the St. Lucia Labour Party have been elected by the people, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, when I peruse these estimates, I say to myself, what will I tell the people of my constituency? What is there for them in these estimates, Mr. Speaker? What is there for them in these estimates, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, the people of my constituency are being made to suffer because they elected me. They have been made, right as we speak, Mr. Speaker, the people of my constituency are being offered tokens, galvanized, plywood, cement, ready mix, just because the government refuses to accept that the constituents have voted for the St. Lucia Labour Party and will continue to vote for the St. Lucia Labour Party in the next general elections. So I'm saying, Mr. Speaker,
Honourable Member, you have 15 minutes in which to come.
How many?
15.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I don't want your generosity. I don't need it. Mr. Speaker, these estimates, Mr. Speaker, and I speak, Mr. Speaker, about the unrealistic nature of these estimates, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government, the projects that the government will announce, the projects that these ministers will speak of, bear no relevance to the estimates, Mr. Speaker. I'll give you an example. The government will speak about building a new police headquarters, but the geotechnical analysis is only now being done, Mr. Speaker. How can you say it when you haven't even done the geotechnical analysis? And that is the story of these estimates, Mr. Speaker. If these estimates, Mr. Speaker, are just a compilation of figures prepared for an election, and to defend them, they are going to be defended by attacking the opposition, as if the opposition has anything to do with the mismanagement of the economy by this government, Mr. Speaker. The opposition has absolutely nothing, no say when the government's priorities are wrong. How can the opposition be blamed when a government that borrows, and I'm speaking about the project for the renovation of playing fields, a government that has borrowed $30 million, Mr. Speaker. Out of that, Mr. Speaker, the consultancy fees on this $40 million are like them to tell me. But what have you done? You have put artificial surfaces on, I think, 4 playing facilities. I have no issues. I'm not getting involved in the technical nature of it, but I'm saying I'm happy when the young people get better facilities, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, but there are playing fields in St. Lucia. There are multi-purpose courts that have been abandoned. In my constituency, Mr. Speaker, there are 2 playing courts. They only get renovated when I am in government, Mr. Speaker. And but the government can spend $30 million to renovate 4 playing fields. A matter of priorities, Mr. Speaker. The government's priorities are based on renderings, show, not priorities that will go to the heart of the people of St. Lucia, not projects that will create a better way of life for the people of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government must understand that St. Lucia is at a stage where people are frustrated because there are 2 St. Lucias. The St. Lucia that the members opposite will speak of is a St. Lucia that is an alternative reality to the life for the people of St. Lucia, to the civil servant who is at grade 5 and free the police constable, Mr. Speaker, the police corporal, the life that these ministers across there will speak of, that life is foreign to the people of St. Lucia. They do not see, Mr. Speaker, any hope for them in these estimates of expenditure. There is no hope. They do not believe that these estimates of expenditure will help them with the trying times ahead, Mr. Speaker. They do not see any hope that these estimates will improve the health care. Miss Anne, who has cancer, sees no hope that the estimates of expenditure will help her get medication for her cancer, Mr. Speaker. The small shop owner sees no hope in his estimates that their life is going to be improved. These estimates, Mr. Speaker, are just a set of figures presented by a government that has lost its way. A government that believed that 4 years was 40 years. Now they are in the 5th year, they have realized that the time of reckoning is nigh, Mr. Speaker. And now they have to account to the people of St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, I cannot support these estimates. We cannot support these estimates. And we call on the government to dissolve this honorable house and call general elections for the people of St. Lucia to decide on the fate of the country. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.